4. The Palestinian question after Camp David. 1. Terms of reference, rhetoric and power. It is to be expected that discussions about the Middle East and the Arab world should now be dominated either by anxious questions about what is or is not going to happen next, especially to the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty and the Palestinians, or by spellbound accounts, positive or negative, of the new era begun at Camp David, or of Iran after the Shah. Ever since the Carter administration came to office, events in the Middle East have been disorienting in their dramatic confusion, even if patterns beginning to emerge after the Iranian Revolution with greater and greater clarity seem to set the stage for definitive change. Many analysts in the West argue that the profoundly felt, almost sublime energies of anti-imperialist and liberationist sentiment feeding Arab political life since World War II seem to have grown weaker. Old, respected demarcations, observed pieties, stable communities have receded in importance as a result. And I think it is true that there is a tighter, less generous nationalism, one might even call it factionalism, in the Arab air. In President Sadat's astonishing overture to and subsequent peace with Israel, the Arab world watched theatrical action for once outstripping theatrical gesture and rhetoric. The American influence has now become not simply a current but an institution, guaranteed by international agreements signed and sealed in Washington and in the Maryland Hills, as far away as possible from the Sinai battlefields, the Palestinian orange groves and plains, the Syrian heights. Lebanon, once the intellectual center of Arab cultural and political debate, is today scarcely an entity, its cities and villages ravaged, its citizens punished beyond acceptable limits, its ideals a cluster of sarcastic memories. Everywhere else one looks there are the facts of extraordinary Arab wealth, extraordinary Arab confusion, extraordinary Arab repression. They sit beside one another with hardly a transition among them. And yet, despite and beyond the so-called death of Arabism, one also sees the collective potential of a great Arab nation which, even though it seems now to be passing through a phase of disunity, can still mobilize the hearts and minds of its people, provided the vision is a true and authentic one. This is a reality one should never underestimate. Yet with all the tremendous attention paid in recent months to the Middle East, there has been no particular analytic quality to that attention. In the United States, the press, the experts, the intelligentsia, above all, the government publicists, have treated the Middle East as a spectacle about which one was supposed to be excited. American interests were involved, there were frequent allusions to the region's strategic and civilizational importance, there were the frequent headline bursts of pomp and drama, a deposed monarch here, a theatrical summit there, a flotilla of warships or unarmed F-15s making a sudden appearance. What was the framework of all this? How, with the continued conflict still in full swing, could one make sense of the Palestinian problem in the new settings provided by the Israeli-Egyptian-American Treaty, the Iranian events, the Baghdad summit in November 1978, the Afghani, Ethiopian, Yemeni, and Far Eastern situations, SALT talks, and what one journal called the New World Disorder? One can begin by saying that the Eastern Arab world, unlike China, unlike Cuba, unlike Vietnam, unlike even Algeria, occupies a curiously middle, mixed place in history, geography, and culture. The Arab world is like and unlike many regions of the Third World. Thus there are numerous possible analogies between Algerian and Palestinian resistance, but ultimately they break down. Similarly, while in its treatment of the native Arab population it is true that Israel is a colonial settler state and resembles South Africa, it is also manifestly the case, as I said earlier, that any total similarity between Jews and Afrikaners is simply not a true one. The Arab world is neither like India, China, or Japan in its relative capacity for shutting itself off from East or West, nor like those countries in the relative autonomy of some of its institutions. All these things add up to the perhaps untidy truth that the Arab world is both ahead and behind, both like and unlike, both different from and similar to, the rest of the Third World. Thus because of the disjunctions, the ruptures, the discontinuities of time and space, any grand idea, like the ideas of Islam or of Arabism or of national liberation, for instance, do not and cannot easily apply. To use such ideas, one must redefine them not in terms of restoring a mythological past, but in terms of living in actuality and a possible future. This problem of redefinition and of political application has been a major problem equally in modern Arab culture and in Western analyses of the region. Ideological labels with an immense miasmic power get substituted for concrete analysis, as much in the heat of Arab debate as in the supposedly cool atmosphere of U.S. policy or academic analysis. Concretely, what does it mean to see the Arab world accurately? Mainly it means that although one can call the Arab region a separate part of the world with its own historical coherence and cultural identity, the Arab world is still in the world, and is a part of Asia and Africa, and in a sense, even of Europe. Yet if one listens to most Arab ideological debate, or looks at recent Arab sociocultural thought, one notices that a lot of it is concerned with separating the Arab world from everything else in order to reassert Arab or Islamic uniqueness, a peculiar Arab type of virtue or sin, a peculiar destiny. In these Panglossian undertakings there has been no shortage of Western experts willing to go on and on about such chimeras as the Islamic or Arab mindset, the Asiatic personality, or the return to Islam, as if all those were monolithic, simple concepts capable of explaining everything. Therefore both Westerners and Arabs have often found themselves in the position of refusing to deal with any argument or any reality that does not conform to one reductive idea. As a result, arguments and thoughts seem sometimes to be enclosed in hermetic packages. But the irony is that these watertight packages make less political sense, put analysis less in the world, make it less independent than one would like. For instead of understanding the precise way in which every national experience or cultural grouping is different from and yet related to the rest of the world, the way in which times change and people change, the Middle East as a whole has often been vulnerable either to facile generalizations and policies that makes it seem like other cultures and nations in ways that are flattering and easy to grasp, or to mere expressions of self-approval which suggest that one can have history on one's own terms exclusively. This is especially true of the idea of liberation and, related to it, the ideas of modernization, peace, independence, development, and revolutionary progress. There is a very good case to be made for the notion that it has been the failure to distinguish between merely borrowed ideas about liberation and genuinely earned ones that has brought the Arabs collectively to their present pass. One purpose of Sadat's initiative, which has culminated in peace with Israel on American terms, is to have asked the question whether talk about liberation, the beating of liberation drums, along with repression at home and failures either to perform well on the battlefield or to appear on the battlefield at all, is better than openly confessing defeat and incapacity to fight if by doing so one is able to get occupied territory from Israel plus huge amounts of American aid. The other alternative to what Sadat did still remains, however, although it seems unlikely to be adopted. Everyone knows what it means to fight a national war. It means full mobilization, it means sacrifice, it means leaders who are genuine leaders with vision and courage. There are very few instances of such leaders, and of such national struggles, today. Too often they exist only in a watertight rhetoric, in an inflated and, I have always thought, a melodramatic vocabulary. The present time impresses upon the Arab world a need to ask what sort of liberation it struggles for, or even if liberation is what is struggled for, as well as what Arabs are to do when they are liberated. Once again, imported answers based on false analogies will not serve, although for a brief period, when ranting and making pompous threats will pass for answers to present dilemmas, they will do. In any case, as Gerard Calliand has argued in his rather bitter book Revolution in the Third World, it is a sobering thought that most liberation struggles in the Third World have produced undistinguished regimes, dominated by state worship, unproductive bureaucracies, and repressive police forces. Even if one assumes that the Arab world at this moment is a considerable distance from achieving liberation, there is still merit in deciding now what is to be avoided in the future as well as what is desired. But any such reflection will immediately produce the realization that, surprisingly enough, there has not been enough discussion about human community in Arab contemporary political and social culture. Neither has any serious attention been paid to the nature of the post-colonial state. This failure can dramatically be brought home by juxtaposing two very different works, Hisham Charabi's Muqaddimat li Dirasat al-Mujtama al-Arabi and Murray Bookchan's study of the Spanish anarchist movement between 1868 and 1936. Let me explain what I am trying to say in terms of these two different books. Charabi's book attempts to dissect Arab society in order to show that what is wrong with it is its hopelessly patriarchal, authoritarian, and atavistic family structure. Whether or not one agrees with Charabi's diagnosis, one still finds oneself asking at the end of the book what it is that Charabi, who is a well-known and prestigious Arab intellectual teaching in the United States, proposes to replace this family with. There one comes up against an almost total blank. True, there are vague suggestions about the freedom, democracy, and modernity that Arabs would get if the traditional family were destroyed, but no more than a suggestion here and another there. Why? For the simple reason that Charabi has not thought about, and indeed our own modern social thought, at least in its academic forms, seems inadequately to have provided him with any specific ideas about what sort of human community Arabs are to struggle for. And here Bookchan's moving study of the Spanish anarchist movement from the 1860s until 1936 seems to me to provide an important insight. Anarchism gave expression to the desire of millions of essentially poor and backward Spanish peasants and workers to provide communities for themselves that were free of repression, centralized bureaucracies, and authoritarian government. No other country in Europe had such a movement, although it was obviously related to all those movements in the West that were influenced by utopianism and Marxism. My point is that with the two exceptions of the now almost forgotten Palestinian attempt to speak about a new form of social organization and the effort of the Lebanese national movement that emerged during the 1975-1977 civil war to provoke discussion about new forms for Lebanese society, there have been hardly any concrete social forms for which people, intellectuals, and societies in the Arab world have concretely struggled, except for vaguely worded and hermetically sealed pronouncements about liberation and the Arab nation. My other point is that as a result one looks around fruitlessly for terms in which to open a discussion of this sort, whether about the state, the structure of society, or the actual forms of modern Arab life. Most of all, one finds two sorts of rhetoric, the rhetoric of negative criticism, rejection, and denunciation on the one hand and, on the other, the rhetoric of Arab self-glorification, self-admiration, self-approbation. Both of these languages have very little in the final analysis to do either with history or with politics. They are too self-enclosed for one or the other. And they simply guarantee that in the future the Arab world will seem to be a place to which things have happened, a place, in other words, where its men and women have not done enough to make changes in it according to ideas and values about human community for which they have struggled. The general Arab failures reflected in the present situation are complemented by what, for want of a better phrase, one can call the U.S. vision of things in the Arab and Middle Eastern worlds. There is some diversity of opinion in the American press, the government, the academic intelligentsia, but the gross imprint of U.S. policy and its conception of U.S. interests is to be found everywhere. It is not an exaggeration to say of this policy that getting oil and setting up armed alliances in opposition to popular and/or national currents form the principal imperatives. This is a crude reversion to the John Foster Dulles view of the world. The clearest statement of current U.S. policy was made on June 12, 1978, by Assistant Secretary of State Harold H. Saunders in testimony before the House Subcommittee on Europe and the Middle East. Saunders listed the basic catalog of interests in general as including a U.S. wish to prevent conflict, an irrevocable commitment to the security, strength and well-being of Israel, a recognition of the importance of the Arab world, in particular the strength and moderation of the major Arab countries, and a moral and humane commitment to the people of the Middle East to help end a conflict that has caused a generation of suffering. Consistent with these interests, Saunders outlined four premises about U.S. policy. First, because each of our interests in the Middle East is important, the only viable national policy is one which enables us to pursue all of those interests at the same time. Second, the experience of the past 4 years has shown that we are best able to pursue all of those interests simultaneously in circumstances where there is progress toward a peaceful settlement of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Third, there has been a significant shift toward the West in the relations between principal Middle Eastern nations and the major powers outside the Middle East over the last several years. Here Saunders listed the end of USSR ascendancy in the region and the realization that Middle Eastern nations preferred the West, which offers the technology and managerial skills needed to develop their countries. He went on to cite the no less important point that moderate Arab leaders have turned to the US for cooperation in achieving peace and development. Their success will limit the role of radical forces. Fourth, without in any way detracting from our other commitments, a definition of U.S. interests in the Middle East must take serious account of the new dimensions of U.S. economic relations with the area. A little later in his testimony, Saunders asserted that it had become U.S. policy after the Sadat visit to turn the United States into something more than postman between the two sides. 3 issues, the nature of peace, Israeli withdrawal and the security measures that would accompany withdrawal, as well as the role of the Palestinians, made up the focus of U.S. discussions with Israel, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Saudi Arabia, although the United States had important agreements and disagreements on these issues with both the Arab states and with Israel. On one point, Saunders was, or at least seemed to be, categorical. In our view, the future of the West Bank and Gaza lies in close association with Jordan, and that an independent Palestinian state harboring irredentist feeling in this truncated territory would not be a realistic or durable solution. All of Saunders' testimony is organized around peace and moderation, a phrase obviously designed to put outside the pale radicalism, nationalism, and popular opposition to the military, social, and economic status quo. More important, I think, is the implied view that any conflict, just or unjust, reasonable or unreasonable, real or unreal, is bad for the United States, since what matters for us is the absence of change, the accessibility of Middle Eastern oil and the vast consumer market to U.S. corporations, and the bilateral links between the U.S. government and every major moderate Middle Eastern regime. Thus a reduction in the level of Arab-Israeli conflict has to come about not by way of solving the problems out of which the conflict derives, but by way of the United States, as simply as that. If in the process territorial, military, and diplomatic issues can also be resolved, that is all to the good. This is clearly what the Israeli-Egyptian treaty was designed to do, in addition to giving the United States what Saunders called a national presence, not just a governmental one. But the highest priority was reserved for setting up military convergences favorable to the United States and optimally unfavorable to the radicals, the nationalists, the popular movements that saw things differently. The net result is that for their compliance, Egypt and Israel have become completely dependent clients of the U.S. arms industry. Let us unpack U.S. policy interests a little further. Underlying the significance of oil and geopolitics is a will not simply to oppose nationalism and radicalism, which are never spelled out, but to identify with their logical opponents, and hence to proclaim unconditional U.S. enmity to forces, like the Iranian and Palestinian movements, opposing a U.S. alliance. What is more, the United States actively identifies itself as an opponent of any effort to transform client regimes, no matter how oppressive and unpopular, despite the much-touted official interest in human rights. In Iran, this not only meant that the United States stood by the Shah, it meant supplying the army with oil during January 1979, after the Shah had left the country, in hopes that the military would stage a coup against the Khomeini forces. It meant going through with a separate Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty in the face of Jordanian, Saudi, and Kuwaiti opposition. It meant continuing to align U.S. interests with isolated and repressive regimes whose major virtues, in the cases of Israel and Egypt, were that they were willing recipients of U.S. arms, loan services, technical expertise of the kind that would further transistorize and render politically illiterate the vast majority of the people, whose interests could never be served by imports of Kentucky Fried Chicken franchises, Coca-Cola, Detroit automobiles, and Marriott hotels. And for every demonstrated failure of this policy, from Vietnam to Iran, to Ethiopia, to Afghanistan, to Pakistan, to Jordan, there was a renewed, a firmer and more expensive commitment to it, as if the United States had an infinite capacity for re-addicting itself to failures like the Shah and Haile Selassie. True, so long as the United States had eager customers like Sadat and Begin, U.S. policy would be set irresistibly in their favor. But again, one wonders what lessons were learned after Iran, where billions of dollars in U.S. arms and numerous warm declarations of support for the Shah and his intelligence and police apparatus failed to save the throne from an essentially unarmed, essentially popular opposition. Perhaps what was learned is directly embodied in the Israeli-Egyptian Treaty, where the United States makes itself one of, and is interchangeable with, those regional governments which say unequivocally that they are willing to go to war to hold on to economic resources owned by others, which are willing to attack any movement not immediately subservient to imported ideas of peace, moderation, and progress, which are anxious to suspend the popular good in deference to what the United States anticipates the Soviet Union might or might not do. The real difficulty of analyzing, indeed even of stating, the shortcomings of such policy visions in the present context is that the media and the liberal intelligentsia, egged on by a government whose interests are being served free of charge, have reserved such concepts as peace, moderation, modernization, and progress for the peculiar strategies of the United States and its allies. Even fiercely independent commentators like I.F. Stone found it hard to resist the arrangements made at Camp David, harder still to avoid speaking of President Carter except as an epic hero. The idea was, as other liberal columnists went on to argue after September 1978, Anthony Lewis being particularly passionate on this point, that Camp David was all we had, and that any other ideas about Middle Eastern peace were therefore essentially violent, spoiling, mischievous. Indeed, it seemed that the agreement between Begin and Sadat was a step forward. Didn't it also mean that there would be no war between Israel and the largest, most formidable Arab country? Didn't it also mean that those other Arabs who opposed Camp David were anti-American, anti-peace, anti-Semitic? Best of all, wasn't it true that for the first time there was a public international agreement on the existence of even the way of settling the Palestinian question? Didn't Camp David have the additional virtue of excluding communism and providing for the peace and prosperity of nice Arabs? Wouldn't it now be the case that instead of devoting their energies to useless war, the Arabs and the Jews could finally begin to build new, progressive, prosperous societies under American auspices? Along with such arguments, and such, in those terms, unanswerable questions went in absolute silence, an ahistorical, shockingly stiff-necked refusal to see what else Camp David entailed, especially on the Palestinian question. No one commented that Camp David failed to deal with, failed even to mention, the Israeli settlements in the West Bank, Gaza, and the Golan Heights. It went without a comment that during the Knesset debate on Camp David, Begin's presentation was made explicitly to depend on an exchange, a deal, which was better for Israel than for Egypt and the Arabs. Sinai would be returned to Egypt while Israel would keep the other territories. No one suggested that the PLO, as well as every single Palestinian, had a reason for denouncing the so-called autonomy plan. It was not even a deception, but an overt plan to put the Palestinians under Israeli military authority forever in a Bantustan, the whole principle of which in Africa, for example, the United States had denounced as being inconsistent with self-determination. True, the suggestion was made during and after the Camp David negotiations, appearing coyly in what were clearly authorized backgrounders staged for the press, that the autonomy plan was the first step in an irreversible process leading ultimately to Palestinian self-determination. And yet the Camp David documents, and Sadat, the self-styled Palestinian champion himself, made no mention of this in the text of the agreements, but only in a set of letters adjunct to the accords, letters cancelled out by Israeli letters nullifying the West Bank and Palestinian hopes for independence. A pattern which began during Sadat's visit to Israel had crystallized. His acting foreign minister had been told by Dayan during the car ride from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem to delete any mention of the PLO from his Knesset speech. During the signing ceremonies on March 26, 1979, Sadat simply left out of his spoken comments any mention of the Palestinians for fear that it might irritate the Israelis. Wherever there was clarity on what the autonomy plan was supposed to be for the Palestinians, it was Israeli clarity and, much more conclusively, Israeli action on the ground. On the day that peace was being signed, Israel announced 20 new settlements on the West Bank, which was already dotted with 77 such settlements. I shall return to Israeli policy on the occupied territories in a moment. The question to ask here is why, for the government as much as for the press and the liberal intelligentsia, no connections were being made between what the peace process was actually doing to the Palestinians and what the Palestinians, and for that matter, most of the rest of the world, were saying or experiencing. On the day after the peace treaty was signed in Washington, the New York Times carried a story by Jonathan Kandel about how on the West Bank, a town undergoing collective punishment for demonstrating against the treaty on March 15, during which a 21-year-old laborer and a 17-year-old schoolgirl had been killed by Israeli soldiers. A 23-hour curfew was imposed on the 8,000 inhabitants, telephones were cut, school, business, and farm activities were suspended, and, Kandel continued, no visits by outsiders are permitted. For an hour a day, under the watchful eyes of armed Israeli soldiers, the residents are let out of their homes, women to purchase food, children to exercise, and forcibly idled men to gossip. "Do not speak to him," shouted an Israeli soldier to a reporter who approached an old man on the main road at the edge of town during the one-hour break. No one is allowed to speak to them. March 27, 1979. When the State Department's 1978 report on human rights abuses was published, the Times carried an editorial attacking the government for daring to confuse issues, peace with allegations of torture, as if to say that items like the one reported by Kandel, which violate every known human rights convention, were minor irrelevancies. What has been worse, I think, is the assumption underlying discourse about the peace process that the Palestinians, never consulted, never represented, never considered, ought to be content with what was so munificently put before them, for their own good. And this at exactly the same time that hundreds of thousands of Palestinians under occupation, the PLO, Palestinians literally everywhere, rejected the autonomy plan, affirmed support for their goals of self-determination and independence, made their voices heard around the world. The question is why no one in the United States asked out loud how is it that approximately 4 million people, dispersed more or less everywhere, have still continued to fight for their inalienable rights to end exile and occupation, unless it was that they really meant what they said, and really felt that what was being suggested for them was unacceptable. Instead, Palestinians were told by Zbigniew Brzezinski that their organization, the PLO, was finished, bye-bye PLO. President Carter, who had magnanimously affirmed that Palestinians had the right to participate in the determination of their own future, a not inconsiderable concession after all was said and done, also argued that the PLO was to us an organization like the American Nazi Party, the Ku Klux Klan, the Communist Party, and we wish it would go away. In the years since he took office, President Carter has expressed his views on the Palestinians on numerous occasions, yet so far as is known has never so much as met a Palestinian, let alone talked with Palestinian representatives. As for liberals, dovish American Jews, civil rights leaders, figures of moral authority in this society, not one of them has taken a public stand on the question of Palestinian rights, as if the Palestinians were a figure of speech to be avoided in polite company, as if those Palestinian civilians systematically being abused by Israel, by Israeli admission, were not the very same people who had been displaced and dispossessed by an invading Zionism that still sought to colonize their last remnants. When Monica Begin met the press, he was never asked how it was that he was elected on a platform promising to annex the West Bank as well as the East Bank, or how he squared his moral zeal about Zionism with the destruction of Palestinian society. But when Yasser Arafat appeared, the press always asked him about driving Jews into the sea, about recognizing Israel, about the PLO covenant, without even a hint that he and the Palestinians he represented were in fact being attacked daily by a state dedicated to Palestinian annihilation. It is not too much to say that the rhetoric of Middle Eastern peace used today without dissent by the United States is coterminous with the desire to trim down, and perhaps even to make disappear, the question of Palestine. And it is this final solution, whether in fact planned for or not, that the Palestinian people now resist. There ought to be no surprise, then, that peace as it is thus defined has found no willing Palestinian participants, a fact the more marvelous when it is also remembered that during 100 years of struggle against Zionist colonization the Palestinian people have produced not a single quisling, no representative willing to accept Palestinian subordination to an overwhelming phalanx of hostile forces officially sanctified by the Western powers. In a very real sense, peace in the Middle East seems achievable by two possible roads, and in an equally real sense the difference between them is at present irreconcilable. One begins at Camp David and ends with an autonomy over which Israel, Egypt, and the United States will rule indefinitely. The result is certainly continued conflict, greater and greater arms supplies in use, more and more popular forces standing against the United States and its clients. That road is premised on the hope that power is persuasive enough to break the Palestinian will to self-determination. It is as simple as that. No matter how the fact is prettified with promises of modernization, progress, and American aid, there can be no mitigating the essential bargain, which is that in return for compliance, Palestinians are being promised their continued national non-independence. The signs on that road are easy enough for every Palestinian to read, although few enough Americans, for example, have been afforded a proper guide to its symbolism. But when it is remembered that in the few years since 1970 Palestinians have had to fight 4 major wars, conducted by Syria, Jordan, Israel, and the Lebanese right wing with the frequently explicit support of the United States, which still cannot bring itself to declare itself for Palestinian self-determination, a not completely unreasonable idea given the mounting expense to the region of making the Palestinians disappear, then Palestinian militancy is slightly less difficult to understand. In the light of what happened after a similar policy in Iran, where the United States allied itself with a repressive puppet against the vast majority of the Iranian people, the consequences of taking such a road again, at much greater direct American expense, are dire. In addition, Israel has its separate peace with an Egypt quite obviously happy at being set loose against Libya and freed from political and social obligations which its leaders have renounced for the Pax Americana. Prepared for more aggression against the Palestinians and what remains of Arab nationalism, supplied with almost limitless arms by the United States, oblivious to its people's real need at some point soon to come to terms with the Arab world, Israel now faces the future. How all this is supposed to lead to a comprehensive Middle Eastern peace defies analysis. Any honest appraisal would certify the road I have been describing as what Eqbal Ahmad, the brilliant Pakistani intellectual affiliated with the Washington Institute for Policy Studies, has recently called an instance of inherited instincts blinding leaders to historical processes in the New York Times, March 26, 1979. Is the American leadership's opposition to anything that smacks of popular nationalism so blind, so uncritically accepted after Vietnam and Iran, that it cannot respond except by further efforts to sell more arms and finance more schemes like the Egyptian-Israeli treaty? This obstinacy is especially disheartening, and is fed to the American people in a rhetoric that insults the intelligence, at a time when other opportunities, the second road of which I spoke above, plainly exist. I shall detail the actualities of that road in subsequent pages. Here I want only to underscore the fact that every Arab state has accepted United Nations Resolution 242 as a basis for peace in the region. The PLO has indicated that in return for a U.S. declaration of support for Palestinian self-determination culminating in an independent state, it will formulate very concrete proposals on peace. Moreover, for the first time in modern Palestinian history there have emerged a legitimate Palestinian leadership, b. a Palestinian national consensus, c. a capability in both instances not only of defining the shape of its self-determination, along lines spelled out in the last 3 Palestinian National Council meetings of 1974, 1977, 1979, but also of changing its position in such a way as to actively promote peace. If one adds to all this the obvious moderation of the Arab leadership with regard to future relations with the United States, and the willingness of the same leadership, after a generation of U.S. opposition to Arab nationalism, to still hold some ideals about the United States, then the attractiveness of a larger, less paranoid U.S. policy for Americans ought to be irresistible. The question now is how long the United States will continue to speak the language of goodwill and peace while pursuing goals in flat contradiction to that language. President Jimmy Carter, like many of his predecessors, is trying to convince everyone that narrowness, militarism, factionalism, interventionism, can at some point be translated into a just and comprehensive peace. My point is that such a transmutation cannot occur so long as those limiting terms are held to, because the transformation is predicated, as historically it has always been, upon the Palestinians giving up their national existence. Until that unacceptable linkage is understood, the illusions, and the violence and human waste, will continue. 2. Egypt, Israel, and the United States. What else the treaty involved? As they stood together in Washington on March 26, 1979, hands clasped jubilantly, ready for a peace that supposedly augured the end of trouble in the Middle East, Jimmy Carter, Anwar al-Sadat, and Menachem Begin appeared in that instant to obliterate the awful, tortuous history that had put them so triumphantly at the center of the world stage. This image, which purported to be the end of the line of conflict and hostility, was immensely powerful. But it did not, indeed it could not, do more than impose a kind of television commercial on a continuing dialectic against which, for the first time officially, the United States now committed its enormous power directly. At that very moment 100 or so U.S. military advisors were in North Yemen helping that country's regime battle South Yemen. Elsewhere in the region the United States silently moved to bolster, or, as was the case with Jordan and Saudi Arabia, to cajole everything that stood against popular disorder, instability, the so-called crescent of crisis. The U.S. position could not have meant any less than a wholehearted unwillingness to encourage those Middle Eastern processes of history to which, in its own history, the United States paid homage, the struggle for independence, human rights, freedom from tyranny. With the popular mind additionally stirred to fear and disgust at Islamic insurrection, how often did one read articles about the threat to Western civilization emanating out of the Islamic Orient, and with resentment mounting at Arab oil prices, the administration's effort to pass off the Israeli-Egyptian treaty as a good thing ran into fairly commonsensical opposition. A CBS New York Times poll conducted in late March 1979 revealed that most people were unimpressed with the treaty. It cost too much, was the popular assessment. There was widespread disapproval at the amount of arms being promised Egypt and Israel. Estimates varied from $5 billion to $15 billion. Over 70% of the respondents disapproved of the American promise to supply Israel with oil for the next 15 years. Yet, as I have said many times, there was a paradox which it would be dishonest merely to dismiss. Jimmy Carter was the first president to have spoken seriously, albeit rather abstractly, of the Palestinian people. Members of the Israeli opposition like Shimon Peres had also begun, for the first time, to speak of Palestinian rights and our interests, and this suggested a notable difference from the past. Thus it was acknowledged that the Palestinians were a presence to be dealt with seriously, even though one must also say that politically their position was so threatened and their existence so constantly in jeopardy that they found it difficult to communicate the substance of their position and needs beyond the Arab world. But given this new atmosphere, why did the treaty scant them as much as it did? What else was going on to which not enough attention was being paid? Let us start with Egypt. There has been so polemical an attitude to Sadat, against him in the Arab world, for him in the West, that he too has become an image stripped of history and political meaning. As early as 1971, during Gunnar Jarring's UN mission to the Middle East, Sadat promised Israel recognition and normalization of relations in return for territory. The Palestinian compartment of his politics has always been an annex to his central Egyptian bulwark. In this attitude, of course, he was unlike Abdel Nasser and also unlike the Syrian Baathists, who were competing with Egypt for influence in the Arab world. Both of their philosophies, however, were quickly matched for ascendancy by two new, non-Arab nationalist camps, Sadatian Egypt and oil-rich Saudi Arabia. During the 70s, then, for the first time in this century the Arab world began also to be fought over by states, and indeed by the Arab state system, not exclusively by transnational, pan-Arab political philosophies. Sadat conducted the 1973 war against Israel as an Egyptian political war, designed at a carefully chosen moment to involve the United States directly in subsequent events. When Sadat later said that the principal barriers between Egypt and Israel were psychological ones, he was saying in effect that no Arab in this century had undertaken to deal with Zionism on its territory, that is, the psychocultural terrain it held unchallenged in the West, unchallenged because the Arabs never ventured there. That Sadat should want to encounter Zionism there, to win support for himself away from Israel in the Western consciousness, was his achievement, and the 1973 war was the first important move that would finally lead to Jerusalem and then Washington. But Sadat squandered his most creative move. His program was entirely an Egyptian one, of course, and it was no accident that a major part of it was a theatrical dismantling of Abdel Nasser's programs, legacy, and position in the Arab world. The effectiveness of Sadat's strategy was not to fight Israel directly, but to attack Israel's monopoly of support in the United States. His reasoning was that insofar as he could always retain the initiative and keep things moving on the world stage, Israel would react by trying to hold on to what it had, with the result that he would be making inroads on Israel's position. To the extent it was obvious that Israel could not fight a war without direct U.S. support, it was also obvious that the more Sadat tied Israel, Egypt, and the United States together, the stronger his position would be and the weaker Israel's. To this end, he completely ended his relationship with the Soviet Union. There is no gainsaying the fact that Sadat was the first Arab leader to make Zionism retreat from previously held positions. That has been his strategy all along. The Saudi Arabians, in comparison, were too hamstrung by their enormously cumbersome wealth, and by the disparity between their wealth and their political military power, to do anything but hold the fort, to restrict the oppositional tide in the Arab world, by massive across-the-board support to conflicting forces, such as the right wing in Lebanon and the PLO. Both Egypt and Saudi Arabia thus found themselves opposed to the still intense fires of Arab nationalism, which the conflict in Lebanon kindled and fanned. The crucial year, therefore, was 1975, for it began the parting of the ways between Egypt and Syria, the 1973 war allies, and conclusively widened the rift separating them from one another. Sinai too did the former, the Lebanese war, the latter. Sadat took the steps he did in Sinai too in order to begin to regain his territory, whereas Syria saw the predicament of lost territory in Arab terms to be retrieved after a comprehensive settlement. Their positions are opposed on this point to this day, and Syria's present involvement in Lebanon indicates, to its partisans, the importance of Arab internationalism, whereas to its opponents Lebanon proved the policy's quagmire-like results. For the Syrian Ba'athist line was that Arab nationalism took precedence over any attempts made to break out of the collective Arab fold, which Ba'athism oversaw. Syria was prepared equally to confront Egyptian particularism or even, as was the case in June 1976, Palestinian nationalism, the most sacred Arab cause of all, which Syrian President Assad believed the PLO had betrayed when his army attacked it in Lebanon. The political agreement that was hammered out during the Riyadh Conference in October 1976 put Egypt, the PLO, and Syria back in touch with one another, very temporarily, under Saudi auspices. Then Jimmy Carter came to office. To an Arab world uniformly unable to assess, or to deal with, his sudden pronouncements about the Palestinians and a comprehensive peace, his arrival precipitated important changes. For one, it seemed almost certain that Carter, whether by temperament or by analysis, found himself closer to the Arab nationalist, i.e., Syrian Ba'athist, argument on a solution to the conflict. Everything up to mid-November 1977 pointed inevitably toward acceptance of the Syrian line. Not only did Carter in May say that he was greatly impressed with Assad after they met in Geneva, but the United States appeared anxious to coordinate Arab approval of a Geneva peace conference, as well as the presence there of the Palestinians, and, most important, the cooperation of the Soviet Union. By early October there was no doubt that a Geneva conference organized along Arab versus Israeli lines was going to take place. This signaled the end of Henry Kissinger's policy of bilateralism, but this frightened Egypt and Israel, who saw that the possibility now arose of a political settlement uniting most of the Arabs with the Palestinians and the two superpowers against Israel. No less than the Israelis, therefore, Sadat opposed the joint US-USSR Statement of October 1, 1977. Not only did the statement put the Palestinian question on a par with the return of Egyptian territory, it also meant a clear victory for Syrian pan-Arabism. After the frightening Egyptian food riots in early 1977, Sadat could not risk a. the postponement of getting back land and ending the state of war. b. opening Egypt politically to the broadly progressive and adversarial currents that the riots unleashed, which were, he thought accurately, connected explicitly with such political tendencies as Palestine, or c. neglecting the disastrous economic and social disintegration of his country. Everything he did during 1977, for example, his attack on Libya in July, was designed to assure him of U.S. attention and pleasure, although until he announced his trip to Jerusalem on November 17, he did not have the United States' undivided and serious gaze upon him. His announcement changed everything. The administration claimed that his announcement came as a complete surprise. I do not think this is true because everything Sadat had been doing for at least 7 years prior to late 1977 indicated his critics argued that it was a shameless willingness to make peace with Israel unilaterally. Be that as it may, the United States quickly adjusted to the new situation, reordering priorities so as to suit a separate Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. The first item to be dropped was the question of Palestine as it had evolved through the United Nations, after that the US-USSR joint statement and agreed-upon Palestinian representation at the Geneva Conference were also dropped. Sadat himself lost little time in detaching himself from the PLO. He was known privately to have said that Arafat could not deliver on anything, and from what remained of Arab nationalism. The entire nationalist opposition inside Egypt was silenced, the Palestinian cause was rephrased, so to speak, in order to make it seem as if Sadat were its champion, and no concession to Israel and the United States seemed impossible for Egypt to make. Sadat counted shrewdly on the fact that his opponents, except for the PLO, were either too unpopular in their own countries to risk adventures against him, or too weak, Saudi Arabia and Jordan, to do anything but refuse abjectly and toothlessly to join his initiative. I do not doubt that Sadat had been in touch with the Israelis well before November, and that one of the first things they agreed upon was the economic benefits to both countries of a joint alliance blessed by the United States, an alliance they all believed the Saudis would implicitly favor as a kind of mutual co-prosperity sphere. Aside from its immediate benefits to the military and consumer sectors of the two economies, the alliance would have the advantage of dividing the Middle East into haves and have-nots, the latter camp being the one in which what was left of radicalism and Arabism would be confined, then snuffed out. Furthermore, Sadat could focus his energies upon Africa. There were already covert Egyptian involvements in Chad, Zaire, and Somalia, and upon transforming Egypt into part of the new trilateral world. By August of 1978 he had even gone as far as making his western desert available to Austria and France as a site for dumping nuclear waste. By the time of the Camp David meetings in September, the Iranian events had stiffened Sadat's resolve to conclude his peace with the United States and Israel, although it was also obvious that the Baghdad summit, especially the impending union of Syria and Iraq after 10 years of hostility, plus the Iranian insurrection and the incipient PLO-Iranian alliance severely tested his resolve. Despite the furious surface rhetoric, every Arab state was in touch with every other state between September 1977 and March 1979. Each one seemed to be trying to impress every other one with its strength and sense of responsibility. In this way too, the point could be made for the United States and Israel. The idea was to appear to be offering the United States other attractive alternatives to a separate Egyptian-Israeli peace. No Arab state made any bones about its willingness to live alongside Israel, nor about its willingness to shuck the Soviet Union in return for U.S. aid and friendship. Still, the United States clung to its more and more narrowly defined priority of an Egyptian-Israeli peace, which it argued could be the firm first step toward a comprehensive settlement. Whether it intended to or not, the United States in fact supported everything that was intransigent and regressive about Egypt and Israel in the interim. Most disastrously, I think, this single-mindedly inflexible U.S. policy alienated the Palestinians, the Arab masses, and the rest of the Third World, which viewed U.S. policy as a defensive, backward-looking reaction to the Iranian Revolution. I do not think this was an incorrect interpretation. To independent-minded Europeans, and of course to most Arabs, it seemed that Sadat had succeeded in thrusting himself upon the American consciousness as a dedicated and loyal American in the Third World. And this, it seemed, played into the United States' fatal habit of being taken in by the likes of Marshal Chiang Kai-shek, and the Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, to the exclusion of more genuinely popular and representative leaders. Most disastrously of all, the United States seemed blind to the results of its support for such leaders as Sadat, Begin, and the Shah, namely that the United States was fortifying their resolve to consider only what suited their immediate, usually their most unpopular, goals, which had to do mainly with keeping their present power intact. Nowhere was this more true than in Israel. The first and in my opinion the most ominous sign was the quickness with which Menachem Begin was rehabilitated from his extremism and terrorism and accommodated to the Sadat-US process. To his credit, Begin made no substantive concessions to anyone. He believed in keeping the occupied territories, he saw the Palestinian Arabs as Israel's coolie class, and he made no bones about wanting to keep Israel the superior Western state in the region. During his tenure as Prime Minister, Begin effectively changed Israel's position on Resolution 242. The man who was later to become his UN representative argued before a House committee in 1977 that Israel had every right to keep the territories, and that what it did on the territories contravened no Geneva or any other conventions, which in any case did not, and never would, apply there. In the meantime Israel tightened its links with South Africa, Chile, and Nicaragua, while its military leaders repeatedly took the position that Israel was a conquering state and its policy toward Arabs, especially Palestinians, was to reconquer them indefinitely. On January 19, 1979, when the Chief of Staff was asked about Jewish settlements in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, he responded that not only was Israel planning to hold on to them, but that those Arabs who lived in the Galilee, which is inside pre-1967 Israel, and a region with the highest concentration of Israeli Palestinians, were engaged in a process of conquest of the land, conquest of the work, illegal immigration, terror. It is important to realize that General Eitan was describing Palestinians who have simply remained there, in fairly abject conditions, for the last 30 years, not new arrivals. But this was not enough for him. He had to reaffirm the fact that before the State of Israel existed we came here to conquer this country, and for this purpose the state was established Yediot Ahronoth, January 19, 1979. Since Israel had no real territorial conflict with Egypt, it was relatively easy to promise to return a demilitarized Sinai to Sadat, with the additional, easy benefits to Israel of things that Zionism has sought for 100 years, legitimacy, the neutralization of the largest Arab state and its political isolation from the entire Arab world, a blanket security arrangement with the United States, an assured oil supply for 15 years, approximately $15 billion in arms and aid, a large, extremely vulnerable Arab market to exploit, and a huge pool of unskilled, cheap Egyptian labor. But where territory was an issue, the most extraordinary measures were taken to make sure that Israel would always control it. The American press, with only a few exceptions, has paid very little attention to what Israel said and what it was doing on the West Bank, and this may be one of the most scandalous omissions in the history of journalism. For by making it appear that the autonomy being offered the Palestinians bore some resemblance to the meaning of that word, the U.S. press performed prodigies of legitimation for continuing Israeli repression, settlement, and consolidation in the West Bank and Gaza. Worse still, the total absence of criticism, whether in the press or in the text of the Camp David Accords, of Israeli policy on the occupied territories made Palestinian and Jordanian refusal to participate in setting up autonomy or self-rule appear irrational and gratuitous. Given U.S. and Egyptian willingness to go along tacitly with what was occurring in the West Bank and Gaza, Israel consequently had a free hand not only in saying and planning what it was going to do, but, as Palestinians living under Israel's oppressions knew at first hand, doing those things. Historically, it has always been the case with Zionism that details count for a great deal more than general principles. Covering those details both with force and with juridical facts has assured for Zionism the permanence of new created realities. For such a program, therefore, Begin brought his particular legal skills to add to what labor governments before him had done. His policy was different from General Rabin's, for instance, only in that Begin trusted much less to mere force and/or improvisation. The occupied or administered territories became known as the liberated territories and, coupled with the admission he wrung from Sadat in Ismailia on December 26, 1977, that Israel's 1967 attack on the Arabs was defensive, an argument that found willing echoes not only among American right-wingers, but at the very heart of the left liberal establishment. This enabled Begin to consider the acquisition of Arab territory as legally justified. It should be noted here that when David Ben-Gurion declared the birth of the State of Israel in 1948, he deliberately left out of his declaration any statement about Israel's borders. Begin took the much neater step of securing the legality of those ever-expanding borders. Moreover, when he delivered his plan for Palestinian autonomy, he was careful to make the distinction between self-rule for inhabitants and sovereignty over the land on which they lived. Like Vladimir Jabotinsky, his ideological master, Begin was acknowledging the undesirability, indeed, the positive harm, for Jews in having to worry about an inferior race, at the same time that he retained for Israel the right to power and settlement over whatever God had said, somewhere or other, was Jewish territory. About this combination of theology, legal refinement, and pure casuistry the U.S. press, together with the liberal academic community, has had very little to say, even as it has delivered many expressions of proper dismay at Islamic excesses in Iran. At the same time that endless, mostly ignorant, hand-wringing disquisitions were being spun out on the possible meaning of Ruhollah Khomeini's Islamic Republic, there was not the slightest effort to understand Begin's theocratic view of things, much less to note in detail what he meant when he spoke of autonomy for people but not for the land on which they lived. To their credit, Israeli journalists and political figures were very forthcoming on these matters. Always, of course, actions spoke a great deal more forcefully than words. Right after the Camp David conference, Begin started to press for more settlements, a project he left in the capable hands of General Arik Sharon, Minister of Agriculture and the country's most outspoken super hawk, whose record includes several murderous raids on Palestinian civil settlements. By the end of 1978, Israel had 77 settlements on the West Bank alone, and it had confiscated approximately 27% of the land. While it is true that the Camp David framework specified a reduction in the number of Israeli troops to be left on the ground during the 5-year transitional period, there was the much more significant fact of a growing Israeli settler population whose vanguard was Gush Emunim, a collection of fanatics whose zeal and violence makes the Islamic hordes seem positively gentle. Including Arab Jerusalem, the number is reliably given as 90,000, with plans for several 100,000 more being made. No doubt was seriously left in Palestinian minds that the autonomy could never become anything more than a carefully regulated, minutely controlled reservation for confining them and, as an authority on Palestinian nationalism who taught the subject at Tel Aviv University put it, for eliminating their national aspirations. On the ground in the West Bank, several important things were being done to assure this. According to the double backbone theory, Israel east of the Green Line, pre-1967 border, would be vulnerable to attack unless the West Bank itself were to be reconstituted as a military backbone paralleling the structure of Israel proper. To this end, the West Bank would be, and already has been, divided into segments by a series of north-south and east-west roads. See map. These would be military access roads, thanks to the generosity of Presidents Carter and Sadat, allowed by the Camp David framework, as well as making up the outer boundaries for a set of quadrants in which the Palestinian population would be concentrated. Thus surrounding every sizable group of Palestinians there would be roads assuring Israeli military control of the area. In addition, the roads themselves would be reinforced by Israeli settlements. As Sharon put it in an interview in Ma'ariv on January 26, 1979, not only should there be settlements, there should be roads which will ensure the territorial continuity between the towns and settlements. And not only roads, a wide infrastructure of army camps and military training belts. Thus continuity for Zionism, discontinuity for Palestinians. Since approximately 30% of Israel's water supply comes from the West Bank, the water sources are to be secured for Israel's use, autonomy or no autonomy. Hence the water supply grid now functions quite separately from West Bank Municipal Authority. The present security situation on the West Bank and in Gaza gives the military governor power to censor everything written, to deport, detain, and destroy the houses of suspected subversives, to take virtually any action whose purpose is to protect the State of Israel. But what is certain, as Ziv Schiff put it in Haaretz on January 14 and 16, 1979, is that Palestinian autonomy will give the Israeli government and army the right to continue this state of affairs more or less indefinitely. Under the Camp David provisions, Israel has the right to fight political subversiveness, the purpose of which, as Schiff said quite plainly, is anything that might advance the likelihood of a Palestinian state coming into being. Thus detention, deportation, and collective punishment will continue since the army will remain on the West Bank. Here is how Schiff foresaw the security operations in the autonomy, whose ruling council is made up of Palestinian, Israeli, Jordanian, and Egyptian representatives. The general security authorities on the West Bank and Gaza succeeded in spreading a good and complicated intelligence network. One can assume that this situation will continue to exist under the autonomy. But the problem is not in collecting information. The question is, what should be done with this information? Will they be able to act freely, or will they be restricted to registering the information and knowing the situation? In order to ensure the right use of intelligence information so as to fight terrorists, Schiff uses the standard Israeli code word for Palestinian nationalists who want independence. There is a need for special conditions, which touch upon other aspects. A strong local police force, as mentioned in the Camp David Agreement, is not enough. Consultation between Palestinian police officers and Israeli security authorities is not enough. It is clear from the security point of view that anyone who wants to fight the terrorists cannot leave the right of arresting people suspected of terrorism or hostility in the hands of others. A Palestinian police officer, who will receive from the Israeli securities information about people suspected of terrorist acts, will not last long if he won't let the suspects know that they are in danger. Therefore, the cooperation of the local, i.e. the Palestinian, police in such arrests should only be formal. And there is no question that interrogation in security matters should be left in the future as well in the hands of the Israeli General Security Authorities. This is a fundamental condition if we want to succeed in fighting the terrorists in the autonomy and in Israel. The situation is different concerning legal prosecution of terrorists. In this matter there can be full cooperation between Israel and the ruling authorities of the autonomy. There can also be cooperation in the judicial area, but this is a more delicate subject than prosecution. In this subject Israel should have some priority, and the same goes for the Israeli representatives on the committee, which is to let refugees in, and it is clear that they shall act according to the directions laid down by the general Israeli security authorities. Haaretz, January 16, 1979. As in much else that Israel foresees about its rule over the autonomy that is supposed to satisfy demands for Palestinian self-determination, Schiff concludes that Israel's security apparatus will therefore touch upon all aspects of Palestinian life. One can well understand how this projected view of the autonomy coincides with Israeli hostility to the Palestinians, but what one looks for in vain is a rationale for showing this plan to be acceptable to the Palestinians who would have to experience its rigors. Nothing in Israel, certainly nothing in what Begin has said, allows Palestinians any hope that autonomy would be anything more than continued military domination. Remember, too, that autonomy and self-rule are to apply only to those Palestinians on the West Bank and in Gaza. Provisions for repatriation of refugees deal only with Palestinians who originally resided in Gaza or the West Bank, that is, approximately 150,000 people who were driven out in 1967. Since even those legitimate claimants for repatriation are to be screened by Israel, it is manifestly impossible for the over 2 million Palestinians who are not from Gaza or the West Bank and who now live in exile, to be taken in. According to Moshe Dayan, those Palestinians are expected to remain where they are. Thus, as one distinguished Palestinian writer described it, autonomy in the Camp David framework means precisely, and not at all vaguely, the following: a fraction of the Palestinian people, under one-third of the whole, is promised a fraction of its rights, not including the national right to self-determination and statehood, in a fraction of its homeland, less than one-fifth of the area of the whole. And this promise is to be fulfilled several years from now, through a step-by-step process in which Israel is to exercise a decisive veto power over any agreement. Beyond that, the vast majority of Palestinians is condemned to permanent loss of its Palestinian national identity, to permanent exile and statelessness, to permanent separation from one another and from Palestine, to a life without national hope or meaning. The Egyptian-Israeli treaty consecrates this situation without any ambiguity at all. The liberal U.S. argument is that, A, under present circumstances this is the most that Palestinians have ever been given, and is therefore to be accepted, B, besides, once the process of self-rule gets underway, with elections, normalized political life, etc., things will probably evolve into a Palestinian state. Like Topsy, such a state would just grow. This was implied in a sympathetic article and Now the Palestinians on March 26, 1979, by Anthony Lewis in the New York Times. But what all such arguments simply do not take into account are the three factors that have made the question of Palestine precisely the problem that it is: 1. The reality of Zionism as a systematic practice for Jews and against non-Jews; 2. The reality of Palestinian history, which is not a miscellaneous collection of haphazard occurrences but a coherent experience of dispossession by Zionism as well as an answering dialectic of fighting progress towards self-determination; 3. The real conflict between Zionism and the Palestinians, a conflict which is not a misunderstanding, but a real opposition between opposed forces, furthermore a conflict embedded in a specific region, having a concrete history, and bringing into play a conjunction of many different regional, international, and cultural factors. There is an almost desperate irony in the contrast between the matted density of these three factors and the optimism expressed on occasion by well-intentioned policymakers. The irony is considerably sharpened when the success of Palestinian self-rule is obviously made to depend upon the demise, or at least the disappearance, of the PLO, and the convenient appearance in its place of reasonable Palestinian quislings eager to negotiate their indefinite political emasculation. None has yet turned up, although of course there can be no guarantee of continued resistance. We must now ask what, apart from unanimously refusing the kind of arrangement spelled out in the Camp David framework and the Israeli-Egyptian treaty, the Palestinians have themselves done and said. It is to that little-known drama that I now turn. 3. Palestinian and regional actualities. When I spoke earlier of the Middle East as a mixed, middle place, I had in mind the eccentricity of the Palestinian problem as well as the peculiarities of the region in which, culturally, politically, and historically, it is set. In other words, even though for the Palestinians it is certain that their dispossession has come about at the hands of an invading settler colonialism, such a view corresponds only to what has happened to them as victims. It takes in neither the real horrors of European anti-Semitism, nor, in the present context, does it speak to the facts that Israel is a state with, for Jews, real accomplishments, that it has the commitment of its people and many parts of the world, that Israeli Zionism and Palestinian resistance do not have the pristine, relatively uncomplicated characteristics of the black majority versus the white minority struggle in southern Africa. Then too there is the problematic fact that the Arab liberation struggle, unlike most other such struggles, is relatively well financed. The sheer presence and availability of almost unlimited capital bears very oddly on even the idea of liberation. It goes without a great deal of argument, I think, that the same problem, qualitatively not as acute, obtains in talking about the Arab liberation struggle, as it is commonly referred to. In that rhetorical context, one need only ask for a precise meaning of Arab liberation when, at the same time, Arab oil states have been willingly co-opted by the Western economies, when their political life is eminently unliberated, and when even the radicals among them have shown at best a flawed inclination to support the Palestinian struggle, for the point to be made efficiently. Even so, I must again repeat what I have said in this book and in Orientalism, that discussion of the Arab world in general, and of the Palestinians in particular, is so confused and unfairly slanted in the West that a great effort has to be made to see things as, for better or worse, they actually are for Palestinians and for Arabs. The danger is that in trying fairly to represent the complex circumstances of the Palestinian-Zionist conflict, I may not be doing enough to dispel the massive accumulation of lies, distortions, and willful ignorance surrounding the reality of our struggle. Perhaps there is no simple formula for letting the truth emerge in such cases, and certainly I would add that in my own case I have the strongest belief that the historical and moral sufficiency of the Palestinian cause will finally outlast and outstrip any attempts to misrepresent it. In the end, of course, it is the struggle of a people, and not only of writers about that people, which determines its history. Nevertheless, writing does count for something, and so certain points have to be made. The first point is that despite all the talk about Palestinians, there has been a political, journalistic, even a cultural tendency always to postpone serious discussion of them. I take it that this is the point being made by intelligent establishment figures like George Ball. See his op-ed piece in the New York Times, April 1, 1979, entitled "The Mideast Challenge." In its understandable zeal to protect and sanctify the Israeli-Egyptian peace, the U.S. government is more than probably going to be supporting the tendency to postponement. Why else does the government continue to hold on to the absurd notion that the PLO can be bypassed, when it is obvious, as senior administration officials have been saying privately, that the PLO is the Palestinian question, and equally obvious too that there is not the remotest chance that any alternative Palestinian leadership will ever emerge? The PLO is too legitimate and representative a body for that to happen. According to the terms of Sinai II and to the agreement made between Henry Kissinger and the Israelis, the United States will not recognize or speak to the PLO unless the latter accepts Resolution 242 and recognizes Israel. This extremely academic and rigid condition, which ties a major power indecently to the petulant whims of a client state and restricts the Palestinian matter exclusively to a refugee problem, has withheld legitimacy for the PLO, and consequently for the Palestinians, in the American political arena. Of course, this has contributed to the postponement of which Ball has spoken. And of course it has encouraged Israel and its intransigent supporters in the United States to go on associating the PLO, and the Palestinians as a whole, with terrorism, radicalism, and irresponsibility. This is not just a question of rhetorical strategy. For one, the press and the intellectual community have gone along with this view with only occasional exceptions. When a major television network recently took the giant step of actually showing a not unsympathetic primetime portrait of the Palestinians, it was done in the form of a film about why the terrorists are terrorists, i.e., they have some reason to be terrorists. The narrator made an unprecedented speech assuring the audience that he did not condone terrorism. And not least, the program was shown without commercial sponsorship. I think it is a simple fact that most Americans who feel they must declare their support for Israel as a state have no idea that the Palestinians lived where Israel now is, and are refugees not because they are anti-Semites, but because the Zionists simply kicked many of them out. This circumstance has served Zionist propaganda well, and it has kept any dissenting view from being heard, much less taken seriously. Therefore, to speak of Palestinian rights is to be forced either to accept the Camp David prison framework, or defensively to explain the PLO covenant, or why it is that Arabs like to kill Jews, or why democratic Israel has to put up with a lot of medieval, repressive Muslims. In the meantime, the government can go on using Palestinian radicalism, to say nothing of continuing to isolate states like Iraq and Libya, as a way of promoting the policies in which it has invested so recklessly, or of keeping alive the option of a military attack on the Palestinians, the Libyans, or the Iraqis. Such demons serve a useful purpose. How else is one to understand the total silence of the United States and of its liberal intelligentsia on the criminal enormity of Israel's March 1978 raid into South Lebanon? U.S. allies were being allowed to launch massive preventive wars with U.S. weapons like cluster bombs against civilians so that radicalism and terrorism could be shown to be punished. Whereas when U.S. allies like Israel sponsor naked genocidal wars, another example Indonesia's sustained slaughter of civilians in East Timor, nothing is said about it. The main result has been to keep Israel associated with politically good causes like Jewish descent in the Soviet Union and to further the elimination of Palestinian nationalism. The circle of discussion, policy formation, and cultural debate grows smaller and smaller, with one constricting tendency feeding off and reinforcing another. The main casualty has been the question of Palestine, which has been one of the most powerful factors in modern Middle Eastern and Arab politics. At no point has the slenderization, the impoverishment of debate been more disastrous than now, for reasons that scarcely need mention here. What I shall try then to do in the pages that follow is to provide some sense of the processes involving the Palestinians and the Arabs. In this way perhaps the reader may be helped to understand matters a little as they are seen by a huge majority of people in the Middle East, and a broader, more accurate framework of discussion and debate may gradually evolve. At least some human and political urgency may be restored to issues that are usually treated as reified, conventionalized slogans. Above all, I should like to continue what I have tried to do throughout this book, communicate an account of the Palestinian question as something that for genuine human reasons has moved a great many people, as something lived and not merely happening, dynamic and historical at the same time. I want especially to develop two ideas, which, given what I have just been saying, are so important as usually not to be considered in analyses of the post-Camp David period. Yet they must be understood if one is to get a grip on political actualities in the Middle East. The first idea is that there have been some very important changes and developments in the Palestinian position since 1967, and these have been expressed, although they have never been given the political weight they so urgently deserve. The second is that only if the Palestinian question is seen in its affiliations with major historical processes in the Middle East, can its genuine centrality and power be assessed or appreciated. I began this book by discussing the difference between Palestine as a historical reality, which no longer exists, and as a present political cause, a process towards self-determination for Palestinians who have no state or proper national existence. Between the time that Palestine disappeared and its cause re-emerged as a political factor on the world scene, a great deal of history had to occur, not least within the Palestinian community itself. For those Palestinians who actually lost Palestine, my parents' generation, in terms of our political leaders, Palestine was Arab Palestine, Falastin Arabia. In no significant way could this generation accept the fact that Palestine had become Israel, or that it would never again in this lifetime be a predominantly Arab country. Much in the political and cultural life of the Arab world in the period between 1948 and 1967 reflected similar views. Israel, at once the unmentionable cause of all our ills and the least known of our realities, absorbed Arab national energies to a remarkable degree. Israel defined the limits of Arabism, it set our enemies for us, imperialism, the West, etc., and it legitimized regimes in more or less everything they did in the name of fighting Zionism. The history of those years, and the perspective of institutions already skewed and diverted by colonialism and skewed still further by the unequal battle between Israel and incompetent repressive military regimes, has yet to be written. But nothing in that history offered much to Palestinians except philosophies and political parties based upon a new, glorious return to the Arab nation and to an Arab Palestine. I say all of this because of what so dramatically followed after 1967. Nasserism, Baathism, the Arab nationalist movement, Islamic fundamentalism, as well as almost the whole gamut of left-wing parties, foundered dramatically after the June War. They have not recovered from that defeat, although in some cases they continue to lead a privileged existence. My opinion is that most of these movements were just partially in touch with the socio-political and cultural realities they addressed. For the rest, they were philosophies borrowed from different parts of the world, different periods of history, undigested and not sufficiently reformulated for the contemporary roles they had been assigned. In none of the Eastern Arab countries, not even Egypt, had there been a decisive rupture between the colonial and post-colonial periods. Certainly this is clear when Algeria is compared with, say, Syria, Egypt, or Iraq. Every change in regime brought mainly a change in personnel. Even though class structure, cultural formations, and economic institutions went through profoundly important developments, they did not quite reach the point of revolutionary transformation. In this way, too, the Arab Middle East remained a middle place, at a kind of equidistance from the overall bourgeois stability of the Atlantic world and the cataclysmic revolutions of the post-war Third World. Abdel Nasser was the only leader of his generation to take seriously the idea of Third World anti-imperialism, but even his interest in the left and in the Soviet Union came after he had been rebuffed by the West. This fact, I think, always shaped his politics. It made him a great leader in one way and a very limited figure in another. Like his many followers in the ranks of the Arab political elite, he subordinated the development of a genuinely oppositional national culture at the popular level to the development of a top-heavy national security state whose main opponents included an abstraction called Zionism, the Egyptian left, the United States, which Egypt longed to attract, and any Arab leader who did not accept Egyptian hegemony willingly. That is why Marxism never got a strong foothold in Egypt, although it is an interesting fact that during the Nasser years it was Egyptian and Arab culture generally that played a vanguard political role far in advance of the regimes. Nevertheless, Nasser was a gigantic figure who, despite his flaws, awakened Arab national energies from their long quiescence. In the process he made Egypt the focus of the Arab world, whereas in having lost its Arab aura, Sadat's Egypt has become a large, nondescript country rather like Nigeria or Brazil. As I said previously, Palestinian politics went through phases of development until 1967 that paralleled and were greatly influenced by currents in the Arab world. When the Palestinian resistance movement gathered strength after 1967, it emerged as the first political movement in the Arab world to confront in an immediate way the presence of Jews in Palestine. During Jordan's rule over the West Bank between 1948 and 1967, Palestinian nationalism continued to flourish, but the Israeli occupation placed the whole question of Palestine in a massively direct adversarial position vis-a-vis Israeli Zionism. This had never happened before. In 1948, Palestinian opposition to Zionism had been neither politically coherent nor effective. The loss of the country was esteemed mainly as an Arab loss, and Zionist policies, as I said earlier, were designed principally to empty the country and not to rule over Arabs. After 1967, the situation changed. Despite dispersion and exile, the Palestinian resistance movement, which later became known as the PLO, formulated an idea and a vision for the Middle East that broke sharply with all past ideas. This was the idea of a secular democratic state in Palestine for Arabs and Jews. Even though it has become almost a habit to deride this idea, there can be no serious way of minimizing its tremendous importance. It accepted what generations of Arabs and Palestinians had never been able to accept, the presence of a community of Jews in Palestine who had gained their state by conquest, but it went further than mere acceptance of Jews. The Palestinian idea posited what is still, to my mind, the only possible and acceptable destiny for the multi-communal Middle East, the notion of a state based on secular human rights, not on religious or minority exclusivity nor, as had been the case with the Syrian nationalists, on an idealized geopolitical unity. Out of confessional and civil conflict was to come a new basis for organizing social life in a region whose politics had been determined either by colonialism or by religion. The ghetto state, the national security state, the minority government, were to be transcended by a secular democratic polity, in which communities would be accommodated to one another for the greater good of the whole. There were many problems with this Palestinian vision. At bottom, few people were ready for the idea, and certainly no one had the exact means to bring it about. But much of its work was done in its mere formulation. For the first time, the idea of an Arab Palestine underwent historical acculturation. For the first time in the region's modern history, and this is what I find of immense value, an attempt was made to grapple with the human and political material for which in the past imported, absolutist philosophies, like Zionism and Arabism, had served. With almost no exceptions at all, political commentators in the West have not grasped the meaning of this change. No one inside the Zionist establishment has grasped it either. Consequently, the idea has long gone without so much as a footnote in present political discussion about Middle East peace. Palestinians were supposed to be ignorant terrorists. Their covenant supposedly demonstrated an unchanging determination to exterminate Jews and Zionism. It became a habit to equate the secular democratic state idea with genocide. In the meantime, Israel still referred to Palestinians as non-Jews, or, an important development, as the Arabs of Eretz Israel. As Israel continued its colonization of the rest of Palestine, and as hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were ruled by military authorities, the Western liberal intelligentsia had little to say about Israeli exploitation of Palestinian children, or the way in which Palestinians working inside Israel were locked up in their places of work at night, or how torture was regularly used in interrogation, or how special laws applied only to Arabs and not to Jews in Israel and the occupied territories. On the contrary, it was respectable cant to speak about Israel's benign occupation, or to animadvert on the economic benefits to Palestinians of the Israeli occupation. And as Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon were routinely bombed, strafed, or napalmed by Israeli jets, one learned to accept these rigors of war as the cleaning up of terrorist concentrations. As one thinks back over the history of the past 10 years, it is difficult to know what exactly was expected of the Palestinians. Their friends and allies wanted some restitution of Palestinian rights, but certainly there was only limited support forthcoming for more than what Resolution 242 seemed to imply. The PLO therefore faced the problem of having to lead a constituency of exiles whose main bulk was from neither the West Bank nor Gaza. Most of the several 100,000 Palestinians in Lebanon, for example, are from Haifa, Jaffa, and the Galilee, at the same time that the West Bank and Gaza seem to be the likeliest place for Palestinian nationhood. Yet the more pressure the Palestinians produced in pursuit of their national goals, the more counter-pressure was applied against them, and the more they drew conflict toward them. Jordan and Lebanon were the two most costly instances of such conflict. Every passing day brought evidence that Palestinian self-determination would require the improbable coordination of Palestinian independence with Arab support, the one often violently at odds with the other. At the same time, Israel controlled Palestine and was drawn, sometimes as a matter of policy, sometimes because extremists simply took the initiative, to the old idea of turning occupied territory into settled territory. Ruling the West Bank and Gaza produced colonial institutions, to which over the years each government seemed more committed. There is no doubt, too, that for the first time in its history Israel had to contend with Jewish citizens who recognized the Palestinians as a problem that had to be treated. In Israel, in Europe, in the United States, concerned Jews, for all sorts of different reasons, awakened to the reality of Palestinians. Doubtless Palestinian resistance and aggressiveness, to the point of terror, played a role, but so also did the reality of seeing Palestinians as bodies prodded by Israeli soldiers or rounded up by Jewish security personnel. Nothing was as important in my opinion as the sheer persistence of the Palestinians. They would not go away, not even after they had been dispersed, driven out, conquered. They still called themselves Palestinians, they still believed that they had the right to return to Palestine, they still felt uncomfortable with the idea of an Israeli, or even an Arab, overlord, no matter how many rewards were offered. Just because Zionism had historically ignored the Palestinians, Palestinian politics during the late 60s and 70s seemed to Israelis always to be a function of the frightening number of Palestinians. To accept the idea of Palestinians was one thing, to offer practical suggestions as to what could be done with them, which meant finding a place where they could be put without encroaching upon Israel, was something else. It must be granted that if Israelis and their supporters have been eloquent and persuasive about the need for Jews to have a state, they have not been a fraction as understanding about why it is that Palestinians have been unwilling to just go away and not bother anyone. The fact is that as the Palestinians continued to be there simply being there made claims on Israel. To admit the existence of Palestinians with a national claim even to a part of Palestine meant contesting Zionist claims, and, as the Franker Gush Eminim zealots said on occasion, to allow that Jews had no right to settle in Nablus or Hebron could mean that Palestinians would start to ask about settling in Jaffa or Haifa. Even dovish Zionists who had qualms about Israeli settlements on the West Bank and who felt a genuine need to make amends to the Palestinians, felt uneasy about saying that Palestinians could have the West Bank and Gaza to set up a state there. Judea and Samaria were not the Sinai Desert. If they were admitted to be Palestinian, wouldn't Israel then become more glaringly a fact of conquest and supplantation? Nothing, except individual conscience and far-left politics, in Israel or Zionist political life, could make room for the Palestinians. No territory, no political, no social space could be cleared for them. Even the West Bank and Gaza, fairly obvious candidates to the rest of the world, seemed a security risk. Although it was usually hinted that a Palestinian state there would be a guerrilla base for attacking Israel, the really obstinate fact being covered up was that Zionism had always denied the existence of a competing national right in Palestine. A Palestinian state was a grave political risk, and so was Palestinian nationalism or simply Palestinians. Talk about terrorism was often a diversion from the dilemma. Even Israeli and Western campaigns trying to identify Palestinians with terrorism could not conceal the fact that a Palestinian terror inflicted minimal casualties and b, as General Gur put it in May 1978, official Israeli military policy has been to attack Arab civilians en masse. In 1974, however, the Palestinian leadership came to an important conclusion. For once it was evident at the same time that Arab Palestine could not be restored, but that after the 1973 war, some combination of Arab military and political pressure could make inroads on Israeli hegemony. Moreover, the Rabat Conference confirmed what had already been evident: the PLO was the only possible representative for all the Palestinians. Thus, when Yasser Arafat came to the United Nations in November 1974, any idea of a purely military solution to the question of Palestine had been given up. For the first time in their history, the Palestinians entered more or less consciously the international political arena where the Zionists had preceded them for almost a century. On occasion after occasion, the PLO stated its willingness to accept a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. Two meetings of the National Council, in 1974 and again in 1977, committed the whole national community to this idea, and with the idea, an implicit recognition of Israel as a neighbor. But these changes came about with much difficulty. Arafat was asking the majority of his constituency to start thinking not in terms of the homes and property and rights they had lost irrevocably to Israel, but in terms of new political gains, statehood, nationality, government rights Palestinians had been denied. His opponents argued that he had capitulated to Zionist imperialism. The rejection front called for unending revolutionary struggle everywhere, as if to prove that everything Arafat did shrank Palestinian ambitions, while rejectionism expanded them. Zionists ignored the political offers Arafat and the PLO were making. The official line simply continued adamantly: the Palestinians didn't exist, the PLO was a Nazi band, Arafat was a murderer of children. Israeli doves attempted to accept the PLO on one level, yet moved away from it on others. Demands were made for a prior recognition of Israel by giving up armed struggle, Arafat was asked to perform concessionary gestures, and so forth. There was no appreciation of what the PLO had in point of fact changed to, nor of what it might further do if there were some answering move on the other side. In the meantime, Israel continued its policy of thickening settlements on the West Bank and in Gaza, while desultory efforts were made to create an alternative Palestinian leadership in both areas. During the 3 years between 1974 and 1977, the United States played an astonishingly destructive and irresponsible role. Henry Kissinger and the two presidents he served gave Israel more arms in a shorter period of time than ever in its history. U.S. policy was deliberately to ignore the Palestinians, to try to whittle down Arab nationalist sentiment in the region, to force political movement into bilateral, step-by-step processes. Always a domestic U.S. issue, the question of Palestine seemed transmuted into a question of how Palestine could be made to disappear into Egyptian or Syrian or Saudi policy. There have been hints that Kissinger's ideas went as far as using the CIA to escalate the Lebanese war so long as that would consume the PLO. Iran was the bulwark of U.S. policy in the East, with Israel's defense capabilities in the West expanded enormously to complement the Shah's. In this way, the United States was planning a long period of banning the Soviet Union and creating stability for itself, with death by choking for the nationalist and radical movements still threatening unpopular regimes. Palestinian signals to the world community and to the United States were deliberately tossed aside. Armed with UN Resolution 3236, which guaranteed its international right to press for self-determination and to be the Palestinians' sole legitimate representative, the PLO with greater confidence now attempted to be a U.S. interlocutor. In Lebanon, for example, the PLO did everything possible in 1975 and 1976 to protect American citizens. On January 22, 1976, the PLO openly supported a Security Council resolution which restated the provision that the Palestinian people should be enabled to exercise its inalienable right to self-determination, including the right to establish an independent state in Palestine in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations. The resolution further went on to state explicitly that all states in the area had the right to live in peace, territorial integrity, and independence, a completely unambiguous statement about Israel's right to exist. With a particularly idiotic and bombastic speech, U.S. Ambassador Daniel P. Moynihan vetoed the resolution. When President Carter came to office, and after he made his important Palestinian declarations in March 1977 at Clinton, Massachusetts, the PLO response was extremely positive. The Palestinian National Council was meeting in Cairo at the time, and Arafat's main speech before that body carefully stated Palestinian reciprocity for Carter's statements. The whole tone of the meeting edged the Palestinians closer to a dialogue with the United States which, it must be remembered, had traditionally been an opponent of Palestinian aspirations. Later that year matters seemed even more propitious. Kissinger had written into the United States-Israeli annex to Sinai II a clause stating that the United States would not recognize or even talk to the PLO unless it accepted Resolution 242, a political document that could never be acceptable to Palestinians. To accept 242 was to deny the national dimension of the Palestinian question, for 242 spoke only of refugees. Yet by the late summer of 1977, through Saudi, Egyptian, and Syrian intermediaries, the United States and the PLO had come to some agreement about 242. The PLO would accept it, but with a reservation, a clause specifying that 242 did not touch Palestinian national rights, which were inalienable. In return, the United States would recognize the PLO, talk to it, and say something definite about Palestinian self-determination. At the last minute, in late August, it was made known to the PLO that the United States would go no further than a dialogue. Thus the reward for swallowing 242 was not to be self-determination, but only the not unqualified benefit of getting to talk to the United States. Obviously the PLO could not accept the resolution on this basis because it meant conceding every political gain, reducing the Palestinian national question to a new refugee problem, going back to square one. In the month before Sadat traveled to Jerusalem, indirect PLO-United States contacts struggled to find ways of making possible Palestinian participation at a Geneva conference, but these efforts were cancelled abruptly on November 19. And still Arafat persisted with gestures. On many occasions he affirmed Palestinian willingness to accept a state, to recognize Israel de facto, to deal directly with the United States so long as, he told me on one occasion, impossible things are not asked of me. Arafat told Anthony Lewis of the New York Times in May 1978 that he could accept a state and thereafter live peacefully next to Israel. He told Congressman Paul Findley the same thing in January 1979. But still impossible things were the order of the day. Recognize Israel in advance, amend the PLO covenant, give up your arms, disband the PLO, accept Sadat's offer and go to Cairo with no preconditions. At every juncture, Arafat's people were under constant attack, in Lebanon, elsewhere in the Arab world, in the West Bank and Gaza, in the United States. During the summer of 1978, then again in early 1979, a murder campaign was conducted against his personal aides in the movement. He faced 30,000 Israeli troops in South Lebanon. Arab political support went from rhetoric to non-rhetoric. And still President Carter went on about the Palestinian question in all its aspects, as if its aspects, or its main substance, for that matter, were somewhere in outer space, waiting to come in for a landing. Nothing in the Camp David framework sufficed to tempt Palestinians, or King Hussein of Jordan, to be encouraged. With Israeli settlements clotting the territory in question, with Sadat effectively removed from any serious role outside Egypt, the treaty totally isolated him from the Arab world, a consequence that must surely have been foreseen by Israel and the United States. It was the better part of strategy to stand on rejection, which of course was no policy at all. The situation now has all the traits of tragicomic irony. On the one hand, Sadat blusters about regaining Palestinian rights, without perhaps realizing that without the Soviet Union, without Arab support, without U.S. support beyond his limited treaty with Israel, his leverage would be verbal at best. The United States, on the other hand, seems uncertain how to go about defining its future role, or the temptations either for or against interventionism, or its hope that Saudi Arabia and Jordan at least will finally come around, or its by now institutionalized commitment to the Palestinian question in all its aspects. Moreover, there is a demonstrably apparent Palestinian willingness to move toward peace. After all, what people can be so committed to its own misery as not to think seriously about alleviating misery, with less and less ground, literally and figuratively, on which to stand? At odds with one another, the United States, Egypt, and the PLO struggle to Israel's advantage. In this country, the organized Jewish constituency has welcomed the treaty grudgingly and criticized it guardedly. The grounds for accepting it are that it neutralizes Egypt and gives Israel some respite, whereas it is attacked because it just might open the door to Palestinian self-determination, an assumption now held by American Zionists. But this community has far more uncritical views of Israel's policy than any but the very far right in Israel, which also tends to view anything connected with Palestinians, even their very existence, as an unmitigated disaster. Aside from such a views being utterly irrational, it is, when advanced by magazines like the New Republic and Commentary, the first surprisingly more stubbornly than the second, intellectually vindictive. What does it urge the Palestinians to do in response? Merely say yes, you drove us out with your guns, we now accept you, we are no longer Palestinians, only miscellaneous Arab refugees whose claims are cancelled out by Jews from Arab lands, you are marvelous, we hereby withdraw from the field forever? Or does the Commentary New Republic view unanswerably say to the Palestinians, we have taken note of your complaints, but that is too bad, you were driven out, omelets can't be made without breaking eggs, but you left, after all. You are a backward, terroristic people and you ask for too much. If we give you an inch you will ask for a mile. We cannot admit that you exist, because we risk losing too much moral credibility on the world scene and, worse, within our community, you must be content. Always with what we give you, which will never amount to anything at all really. And that is also where, so far as the official United States is concerned, the matter now rests. Some time ago it would have been possible to remind President Carter that he came to office with, among other things, the famous Brookings Report of 197,530 high on the agenda. After all, National Security Advisor Brzezinski was on the panel that wrote the report, and Brzezinski's assistant, William Quandt, was a member too. But that is now a forgotten relic of an earlier time. The drapery produced by the Israeli-Egyptian treaty curtains off Syria, Iraq, the PLO, even Saudi Arabia and Jordan. All the indications that Zionism has finally gained what for 60 years it has wanted, legitimacy from one Arab regime and that regime's subsequent isolation, seem lost on the United States, which assumes that heaping the region with arms and many promises about the peace process will turn Camp David miraculously from lukewarm water into sparkling wine. As for the region itself, what are the important actualities? In the first place, there is now the possibility that for the first time since 1967 a genuinely popular Arab nationalist response might develop to the United States and to its allies in the treaty, and that portends a wave of extraordinary upheaval in the area. The Palestinian issue, as I suggested earlier, has become far more than an irredentist question. It has turned into the symbolical nexus of nearly every Arab, Islamic, and Third World popular, in the literal sense of that word, issue in the region. One of the main questions now is whether Arafat and the PLO will be willing indefinitely to contain the question. The Iranian response to the Palestinians after February is one index of what I mean. Others have been no less powerful. The Kuwaiti parliament was closed down in late 1976 because the Palestinian issue had crystallized there as something uniting opposition to the regime. The PLO did not exploit this situation, but obviously could have. The press in most of the area is muzzled, but Palestine has become the acceptable trope for bringing criticism to bear on state authority, and this trope galvanizes opposition very acutely. The March 1979 meeting of the Baghdad Conference was united in opposition to Sadat, Israel, and the United States, but it was the PLO that brought the whole ungainly Arab bolus to the forefront. More and more hidden currents are released every day: regional sectarianism, nationality questions, numerous, often pitifully simple-minded, forms of Islamic revivalism, and always, burning questions of unequal distribution of wealth, sometimes linked to sexual and ethnic oppression. The danger in all this is not revolutionary change as such, it is protracted incoherence, and for the PLO, now a concrete national reality, a protracted postponement of achieving its national claims on the question of Palestine. Neither the immediate nor the medium-term answer to the question of Palestine can be found in an ostrich-like pact between Israel and Egypt which shuts the Palestinians out completely. Both countries, each according to its peculiar internal dynamics, will in such a context harden their military, ideological, and political apparatus against the region, and thereby become less a part of it and more a lonely fortress, isolated and vulnerable in ways we cannot at present imagine. The imperatives are clear, let me outline them here very briefly. The question of Palestine is, as I have tried to show in this book, a matter with a detailed history traced in the lives of every one of the 4 million Palestinians. It is not something that can be made, whether by legal, military, cultural, or psychological means, to go away. Yet, and this is the positive point I want to insist on, the question of Palestine is a concrete historical one that can be comprehended in human terms. It is not a gigantic, psychological monster poised to threaten the entire world. But this is precisely how it has been represented. Zionism first refused to acknowledge the existence of native inhabitants in Palestine, and when it did, it recognized only native inhabitants with no political or national rights. Insofar as those natives claimed rights, the West was instructed systematically in equating the struggle for those rights with terrorism, genocide, anti-Semitism. This is not only nonsense, it is also licensed to extend a century of violence against Palestinians for another long period of time, and to refuse more or less indefinitely to settle with history and with truth. Worse still, such an attitude simply ensures the recurrence of more violence, more suffering, more waste, more futile security arrangements. The almost total impossibility of talking rationally about the Palestinian question in the United States today is of service neither to this country nor to Jews. On every level, it seems to me an incontrovertible fact that an attitude of negation, of denial, of fear, which is what Zionist and U.S. perseverance against the Palestinians has meant, will only produce more fear, less peace. Is there not an astonishing irony in a state of affairs by which the United States does not permit members of the Palestine Liberation Organization to speak or travel freely in this country, while at the same time saying that the Palestinian question is at the center of the whole Middle East conflict? In the end, there has to be a realization that the Palestinians are not going to disappear. In addition, the United States must officially recognize that fear of the Palestinians and their unanimously acknowledged representatives cannot be allayed simply by pretending that together they do not amount to anything very serious. I do sympathize with, I understand as profoundly as I can, the fear felt by most Jews that Israel's security is a genuine protection against future genocidal attempts on the Jewish people. But it is necessary to remark that there can be no way of satisfactorily conducting a life whose main concern is to prevent the past from recurring. For Zionism, the Palestinians have now become the equivalent of a past experience reincarnated in the form of a present threat. The result is that the Palestinians' future as a people is mortgaged to that fear, which is a disaster for them and for Jews. I have tried here to present the Palestinians as representable, in terms of our collective experience, our collective sense of things, our collective aspirations, above all, as a real and present, because historical, reality. Nothing that I have said in this book must be understood except as an acknowledgement of Palestinian and of Jewish history, in fierce conflict with each other for periods of time, but fundamentally reconcilable if both peoples make the attempt to see each other within a common historical perspective. Better fully acknowledged conflict than hidden and unstated fears, rigidly theologized fantasies about the other. I would not have gone into as much detail about the Palestinian experience of Zionism if I did not believe that the Palestinian national movement has today crystallized into and around a specific set of national aspirations. My aim therefore was not to resurrect the past, but to see it clearly in order to get beyond it. Palestinian national aspirations derive intimately and urgently from our concrete experience as a people, and they are, I think, achievable aspirations given our history, the reality of Israel, the reality of the rest of the Arab world, and international political configurations. It is no exaggeration to say that for the first time in our struggle against Zionism the West appears ready to hear our side of the story. Therefore we must tell it, we must stand in the international theater created out of our struggle against Zionism, and there we must diffuse our message dramatically. In the West especially our aim should be first to engage the liberal Zionist establishment, Jewish and non-Jewish alike, that has for so long turned its back on Zionism's victims. Everyday Israeli occupation practices on the West Bank and in Gaza, as well as Israeli attacks on civilians in Lebanon, pass without so much as a gesture of disapproval from Jewish intellectuals who have traditionally been in the forefront of human rights causes. This community of writers, intellectuals, scholars, and professionals has betrayed its human mission. Why, for example, did not the mass expulsion of 250,000 civilians from their homes in South Lebanon by Israeli forces using cluster bombs during the spring of 1978 elicit a single public expression of condemnation? The outrages go on every day, yet no one says anything. Can this silence be adequately explained by the argument that an Israel besieged by terrorists can do no wrong, or at least nothing to provoke a word of criticism by responsible Jews? Second, we must enter the political and cultural debate about the Middle East peace in full force. We cannot any longer be pacified with observer status, nor with empty repetitions of how the Palestinian problem is, or is not, the center of the Middle East conundrum. We have made good progress in both these tasks already. It is a matter of national pride that today's Palestinian is better schooled in the ways of political democracy than any other Arab, and this despite dispersion and exile. More Palestinians than ever speak today in positive detail of what the future must bring for Jews and Arabs alike. No Arab community understands the processes of political history more intimately than the Palestinian, and no community is more likely than ours to continue direct democratic participation in national life. This is why one facet of the Palestinian mission is to demonstrate the poverty of institutional and ideological domination, and how even the most oppressed and the most dominated can envision a generous political state of affairs. In recent years, leading Palestinians have occasionally spoken from the depths of their exile and misery of a time when Palestine would become the site of two societies existing together, side by side, in peace and harmony. In time, perhaps, such a thing will be inevitable. Now, of course, it seems very far away. But if more Palestinians, more Jews and Americans, in short, if more people take up the question of Palestine as a matter for the common good of Palestinian Arabs and Israeli Jews, then the day will come soon enough. As far as I am concerned, the Palestinian mission is a mission of peace. I am sure that this is true for the vast majority of our people. We are not just a population of exiles seeking restitution and national self-determination, we have recreated ourselves as a people out of the destruction of our national existence, and our national organization, the Palestine Liberation Organization, has symbolized both the loneliness of our vision and the wonderful power of our faith in it. Certainly when the PLO is compared with the Israeli Army or Air Force, and when our civilians in refugee camps support the PLO while willingly exposing themselves to Israeli bombers, it is clear that the Palestinian cause means a choice of peace and human will over steel and sheer force. Our presence on the political stage, as poets, writers, intellectuals, militants, has invigorated the entire Arab and Third Worlds as none of its political ideologies has. In the end, the Palestinian mission comes down to individuals, whether it be a leader like Yasser Arafat, or a poet like Sami al-Qassem, or any one of thousands of dedicated men and women in Lebanon, Gaza, Nazareth, or Detroit, who by standing before the world and before Zionism can ask the question, are you going to eradicate me to make way for someone else, and if so, what right do you have to do so? Why is it right for a Jew born in Chicago to immigrate to Israel, whereas a Palestinian born in Jaffa is a refugee? The real strength of the Palestinian is just this insistence on the human being as a detail, the detail likely to be swept away in order for a grandiose project to be realized. The Palestinian therefore stands on a small plot of land stubbornly called Palestine, or an idea of peace based neither on a project for transforming people into non-people nor on a geopolitical fantasy about the balance of power, but on a vision of the future accommodating both the peoples with authentic claims to Palestine, not just the Jews. I must be blunt about the alternative. The Middle East is more heavily armed, more politically mobilized for war than any other region of the world. At present, Israel is helping South Africa with its nuclear program and has not signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. There are at least half a dozen states whose regimes are seriously threatened both by internal and external forces. The United States is committed to the region in ways that its citizenry, or its government for that matter, can scarcely comprehend. There is oil, there are markets, there are geopolitical interests, there are nuclear options at stake. The Soviet Union interlocks with the United States in the Middle East, thus doubling the problems. To this huge mound of imponderables it has been customary to bring political analysis armed mainly with ideological clichés of a frightening, blinding simplicity. Israel, for example, has still not taken the step of scrapping its official division of its own population into Jews and non-Jews. Rarely have the concepts of justice, realism, and compassion played any role, much less any serious role, in attempts to think about the Middle East, which has been commanded by outdated generalities like coarse nationalism and great power interests, rarely by ideas about individual human rights. In the end, it is finally the humblest and the most basic instrument that will bring peace, and certainly that instrument is not a fighter plane or a rifle but. This instrument is self-conscious rational struggle conducted in the interests of human community. It is, for the Middle East, for the United States, and for the world, really asking the question of Palestine, going to great lengths to seek answers, speaking, writing, acting together with others to make sure that the just and right answers are the ones settled upon. Avoidance, force, fear, and ignorance will no longer serve. 4. Uncertain future. Two things are certain: the Jews of Israel will remain, the Palestinians will also remain. To say much more than that with assurance is a foolish risk. I have little doubt that the United States will press on with negotiations between Israel and Egypt over Palestinian autonomy, or that in the short run Jordan will not join in, will take harder and harder positions, or that no Palestinian of any consequence will participate in the unpleasant process. But consider the variables. Egypt is a huge question mark. Will opposition to Sadat increase? Can the regime long survive its isolation from the Arab world? Saudi Arabia and Jordan are in a peculiarly acute position at present, and that too is bound to change. Can either or both of them continue to resist U.S. pressure? Will their ruling houses outlast their internal problems? Will the effect of Iran's revolution make itself more strongly felt? Iran itself will continue to go through upheaval for months to come, with enormous consequences for the region, the world economy, and geopolitics. Syria and Iraq may or may not play the role in Arab politics that their forecast union seems to promise. Each country has so peculiarly individual a sense of its regional priorities. Contrast the Syrian role in Lebanon with Iraq's attitude toward Iran as to make the outcome of the Baghdad alliance impossible to determine. Saudi behavior in the years ahead is of major importance. I do not think that the royal family, internally divided as it now is, will precipitate total breaks with any Arab state or grouping. The question is how hard the Saudis will push economically for one or another political line in the region. About such mercurial regimes as the Libyan, it is even more difficult to be precise. Certainly there can be no ruling out the possibility that Libya will be under severe attack, perhaps by Sadat, perhaps from other quarters, but its oil wealth will not easily be handed over to Egypt, which in the present U.S. scheme of things is better kept economically insecure. There is a disturbing probability too that Jordan's uncertain status quo might tempt Israel to a strike, especially if by Israel doing so the Hashemites could be made to give way to some sort of Palestinian polity on the East Bank. Israeli politics, no less than American policy, seem rather more fixed and determinate than they may really be. Personalities like Moshe Dayan have been gesturing towards Syria and the PLO, but the chorus of protest, in the United States and in Israel, has been deafening. Such initiatives can continue indefinitely without significant change in the official Israeli position. After the spring 1978 Israeli attack on South Lebanon, there has been serious thought given to a final solution for the Palestinians. To Palestinian partisans, Camp David is the political design lending credence to that pessimistic view. How far the views on Palestinian self-determination of Israel and the United States converge is the main question now. An added complexity is Egypt's role, both with Israel and, to a certain extent, against it. Economic issues of vast importance and social revolution, the region is inherently rife with both, are certain to influence the future of peace in the Middle East. The United States, for example, has gone on record as being willing to invade an oil country if energy supplies seem threatened, and certainly since the Shah's fall both Israel and Egypt have been advertising themselves as willing gendarmes. The crucial point, which may be an irrational one, is what power is going to tolerate what level of economic or political provocation. Will one protest movement turn insurrectionary? Will another regime move against a neighbor? Will the simmering anarchy of Lebanon, example, continued Israeli support for renegade Christian militants in the south, or the continuing revolution in Iran tempt an intelligence service to some plot or other? Will Israel extend itself east or north? Will the United States increase its direct military support to various regimes? The questions are multiple and there is no way to answer them at present. My point is simply that there can be no blueprint or scenario, no matter how sophisticated and accurate, sufficiently complex to account for every possible, extremely consequential impulse surrounding the question of Palestine. In its defensiveness and its anxiety to protect its imperial interests, United States policy projects something resembling a blueprint for Palestine. Certainly self-rule and autonomy, well short of self-determination and independence, are the main ingredients. The assumption is that because of its power and interests the United States has the right to decide for people like the Palestinians what is best. Every such effort at liberal interventionism in recent U.S. history has failed, and there is no reason to assume that the projected Palestinian tutelage will not fail also. But I am not such a mechanistic determinist as to believe that the failure will simply take place, or that Palestinian self-determination is guaranteed as a result. I prefer to rely on the Palestinian will to self-determination, which I have tried to describe in these pages, and on my confidence that in the United States an estimably large group of people will come to the realization that the policies that brought disaster in Vietnam must not be used against the Palestinian people. That there will be a significant Palestinian counter-response to what is now taking place as a result of Camp David, I have no doubt. The PLO gathers support every minute now, and in the short run, it is also going to attract greater Israeli opposition and support. But because the present situation is essentially at an impasse, and because current ideas that leave out the PLO are proven bankrupt, it is far too tempting to say confidently that a Palestinian political initiative will emerge and will carry the whole region forward. In many ways, such an eventuality would be a positive result of the Egyptian-Israeli treaty. But we must not forget that Palestine is also saturated with blood and violence, and we must look forward realistically to much turbulence, much ugly human waste, in the short term. Unhappily, the question of Palestine will renew itself in all too well-known forms. But so too will the people of Palestine, Arabs and Jews, whose past and future ties them inexorably together. Their encounter has yet to occur on any important scale. But it will occur, I know, and it will be to their mutual benefit. Epilogue. As if to demonstrate its power to make linkages when and how it saw fit, the United States brought together Israel, the Palestinians, Jordan, Syria, and Egypt at a Middle East peace conference in Madrid on October 30, 1991. With its military victory in the Gulf War tarnished by Saddam Hussein's survival and his merciless triumph over Kurds and domestic enemies alike, the Bush administration sought rather transparently to cap its role as the last superpower with a show of impressive peacemaking drama. Even Mikhail Gorbachev's practically defunct Soviet Union was brought in as co-sponsor, and with the United Nations completely excluded, even as the United States used the Security Council on a daily basis for its continuing interventions against Iraq, the stage was set for what was described as an historical breakthrough. Between the end of the Gulf War in March 1991, during which exercise in power projection the United States refused to allow any connection to be made between Iraq's lawless occupation of Kuwait and Israel's 24-year-old equally lawless occupation of Arab lands, and the last few days in October of 1991, Secretary of State James Baker shuttled to and from the Middle East, bringing all the major participants into line. Israel was granted virtually all of its demands, no PLO participation was allowed, no residents of East Jerusalem were to be members of the Palestinian delegation, no Palestinian exiles, who constitute over 50% of the total Palestinian population, were to be present. The Palestinian delegation was to be part of the Jordanian group, no discussion of final status issues was to occur in the bilateral talks, no role was given to the United Nations, and the United States would convene, but would not manage or otherwise lead, the discussions. These fulfilled demands were obtained by Baker as conditions exacted from the Palestinian negotiators, Faisal Husseini and Hanan Ashrawi, who even when they proclaimed themselves to be acting for the PLO were supposed not to be doing so. Thus the puerile and flawed procedures of the conference, with innumerable and unilateral concessions by the Palestinians, were designed to reflect the price paid for Palestinian weakness. This was the result of United States backing of Israel, and of what was described routinely as the PLO's having sided with Iraq. Each of the several times that Baker arrived in Israel for his discussions there, the Israelis brazenly established one or two new settlements, which now total about 200. Needless to say, Israel's conditions and practices in the occupied territories were exactly the same before the Gulf War, and got a good deal worse after it. But the clumsily named peace process was dotted with one after another contradiction. For their pains in having negotiated Palestinian participation with Baker, Ashrawi and Husseini were excluded from the formal Palestinian delegation, which was headed by Dr. Haidar Abdul Shafi, and relegated in Madrid to an advisory delegation that was physically banned from the so-called Peace Palace. In the process of projecting itself as even-handed, the United States simply turned the other way or remonstrated diplomatically as Israel increased its abuse of Palestinian rights across the board. Not a mention was made in Madrid by the United States of the 17,000 political prisoners held in Israeli jails, nor of the 2,000 demolished houses, nor of the 120,000 uprooted trees, nor of the closed universities and schools, nor of the curfews, nor of the punitive taxes, pass cards, and laws, nor of the hundreds of censored books, nor, finally, of the over 1,000 Palestinian deaths caused by Israeli military violence since the intifada began in late 1987. Whereas the United Nations Security Council had passed more than 60 resolutions, the most recent in January 1992, condemning these illegal practices, the most that President Bush and Secretary Baker could muster was a phrase about the settlements being an obstacle to peace. Far from freezing them, Israel added to them remorselessly. And the dispossession of Palestinians continued unabated. Much if not all of the media focus at Madrid was on what was described as the new Palestinian image. True, the speeches and press conferences were an occasion for the Palestinian message of peace and reconciliation to be heard. But it was not at all new, and had been spoken about, acted on, and reiterated countless times with little attention from the media, whose lazy view remained that the main issue of concern to Israel was Palestinian terrorism and rejection. A breakthrough was also announced for American policy at Madrid, although there, too, the continuities with the past were quite evident. There was, centrally, an unchanged United States commitment to Israel that included a roughly $5 billion annual subsidy and a sustained unwillingness to curtail aid, no matter what Israel did. Thus the annual Amnesty International survey noted that, along with Turkey and Egypt, Israel was at the top of the top 3 foreign aid recipients, yet, in contravention of American law, violated human rights on a massive scale without any admonishment or reduction in aid. The law was simply suspended, and the aid poured forth. Moreover, the other side of this policy, the United States at Madrid remained unwilling to pronounce the phrase self-determination for the Palestinian people, and unwilling to recognize the universally recognized Palestinian National Authority, the PLO. Yet it is also true that the Bush-Baker team was different from the Reagan-Schultz team in that Reagan's vice president was not dependent for his election in 1988 on the American Jewish vote, and had made no secret of his displeasure with Israeli policy under Shamir. Bush and Baker did do what had been unthinkable for a decade, postpone consideration of Israeli requests for additional aid, in this instance $10 billion in loan guarantees to house Soviet Jewish immigrants, most likely in the occupied territories, and get Israel to appear at a peace conference. But things did not go a great deal further. For the bilateral talks held in Washington in early December 1991, Israel postponed its appearance petulantly by a week, thus leaving the Arab delegations to cool their heels. When the Israelis finally did present themselves, they refused to meet with the Palestinians as a separate delegation, thus contravening both the spirit and the letter of the United States invitation, which had envisioned separate discussions between Israel and the Jordanians, and Israel and the Palestinians. The central problem is the official Israeli refusal to recognize or deal with the fact of Palestinian nationalism. Here, too, the depressing continuity with a historical attitude of blindness and denial is all too clear. Just as the early generations of Zionist settlers came to Palestine as if to an empty, or a negligibly populated, country that was theirs for the colonizing, so too do their successors fail to see in the Palestinian people anything more than a bunch of aliens that must be gotten rid of or otherwise rendered inconsequential. Of course there are many Israeli and non-Israeli Jews who do not feel this way and who have tried for at least 2 decades to oppose Israeli policy, but they have never been more than a vocal and often very courageous minority in Israel and in the diaspora. Such individuals and groups have done little of importance to stop General Ariel Sharon as his settler surrogates shoot up West Bank and Gaza towns, drive people out of their homes in Arab East Jerusalem, Silwan, and force the government to deport Palestinians whenever there is resistance to Israeli bullying. More to the point, I believe, is the fact that for at least 3 generations Western liberals have continued to support Israel in whatever it does, largely, I think, because of their guilt over Western anti-Semitism and also because Israel's image in the West has somehow escaped the contamination of the country's own policies and practices towards the Palestinians. As I write these lines, 12 leading Palestinians from the occupied territories are to be deported in retaliation for the killing of an Israeli settler. No one has been specifically accused of his murder, so the deportations are collective punishment expressly forbidden by the Geneva Conventions which, it should be recalled, were solemnly agreed to by the international community, Israel included, in the aftermath of Nazi policies of inhuman persecution. A few weeks ago, the Israeli Defense Ministry renewed for 3 months its closure of Birzeit University, the leading West Bank institution of higher learning, continuously forbidden to open its doors since early 1988. There has been little outcry among Western intellectuals or academicians, no campaign of support for students and faculty denied their rights to teach and to be taught for 4 years by the government of a state that has received $77 billion since 1967 from the United States. Unlike South Africa, Israel has not been boycotted, although what Israel does on the West Bank and in Gaza more than rivals the practices of the South African government during the worst days of apartheid. In the meantime, the situation of the Palestinian people goes from bad to worse. Israel categorically refuses to commit itself to what all the Arabs have agreed to, an exchange of territory for secure peace. The leading Arab states are either indifferent or hostile. In all cases, however, they are mostly powerless before the United States, which by its devastating war against Iraq has convinced them all that their only recourse as unpopular and isolated regimes is a supine compliance with the wishes and whims of Washington. Other sources of support for the cause of Palestine in the Islamic, African, or Eastern European world have diminished, much as the enthusiastic support for the notorious Zionism is racism resolution at the United Nations also dissolved without even a debate on the issue of whether Zionism discriminated against Palestinians, non-Jews, or not. Yet what seems perfectly clear is that the valiant resistance of the Palestinians themselves will actually increase in time, and that they will neither disappear nor abandon their rightful claim to an independent state in confederation with Jordan. Although the struggle over Palestine is grounded in the land itself, its astonishing international resonance, especially in the hearts and minds of Western, and particularly American, citizens, remains crucial. Palestine is the last great cause of the 20th century with roots going back to the period of classical imperialism. I am certain that its partisans, Arab and Jewish, will outlast the opposition, because it is certain that coexistence, sharing, and community must win out over exclusivism, intransigence, and rejectionism. The Palestinian people today constitutes a nation in exile, and is not a random collection of individuals. Anyone who knows the least bit about this people knows, too, the profound existential ties that bind it together, and that connect it historically, culturally, and politically to the land of Palestine. For too many years, the official policies of Israel and the United States, quite unlike the attitudes of the rest of the world, assumed that the Palestinians would fade into the Arab world, that Jordan would become Palestine, that Palestinians would accept permanent subservience under a Bantustan-like limited autonomy, or as the Likud formula has it, autonomy for people, not for land, that the people may even be willing to perform an act of collective politicide on itself and declare itself null and void. That is to fail completely, in moral and psychological terms, to grasp the reality. Nothing less than Palestinian self-determination will do, and only that will ever defuse the already far too explosive Middle East. Yet some Israelis and non-Israeli Jews have in fact understood that if Israelis and Palestinians can have any decent future, it must be a common one, not based on the nullification of one by the other. In 1988, we Palestinians as a people took a giant step towards reconciliation and peace. We now await a corresponding gesture from the Israeli people and its government. Use. New York. January 10, 1992.